Hello, I'm Bev Derewianka and I'm going to introduce you to a teaching and learning cycle that we use when we're developing students' literacy. The first thing that we have to consider when we're teaching literacy is what's our starting point? Do we start with the topic? Do we start with developing some ideas? Do we start with spelling? Do we start with grammar? These are the kinds of decisions that teachers have to make. But the problem with that is that it fragments literacy. So we need some way of bringing all of those literacy resources together. And the way that we do that is to think more about teaching literacy through tasks. So what is the task that the students are engaged in? And when we think about the task, we think about how language and literacy are taught in the context of these tasks that they'll be doing. Tasks across all areas of the curriculum. The question then we need to ask is, well, what are the language and literacy demands of the tasks? What kind of language resources will the students need in order to achieve the outcomes of that task? When we think about schooling and what kinds of language we need to use when we're involved in doing tasks, then we need to think about things like, do the students need the kind of language for investigating that they'll need to use in a task? Or they might need to be doing a problem-solving task, and what's the language of problem-solving? It might be that they have to do some evaluation, and that requires a different set of resources. They might need to describe, so what's the language of description? They might need to argue, so again we'll need a different set of resources for arguing and persuading somebody to your point of view. Or they might need to debate an issue, again similar but different resources for doing that. They might need to recount what happened, or they might need to explain how something works or why something happens. All of these different purposes for using language require different sets of language resources. So that's our job, is to identify what it is in this task that the students are going to need to do through language, and what are the typical language resources that they'll need in order to achieve the task successfully. We refer to these as the genres of schooling. So each different purpose for using language requires a different genre. An explanation genre, a persuasive genre, an evaluating genre, etc. So the kinds of genres that they might be needing to use are a sequence of events, such as a recount or a timeline. They might need to describe something in some detail, so an information report on all the various aspects of Wales, for example. They might need to describe the parts of something, so the whole and its parts. So a different type of information report, this time looking at part-whole relationships. They might need to look at various categories, how to classify something. So in this case, we're going to need a genre that allows the students to categorise, look at class and subclass relationships in this case. It might be a cause and effect genre, so looking at the cause and the effect of a particular input. Or it might be an explanation looking at the consequences of something. All of these are different purposes that they might come across in their different tasks, and therefore they're going to need to learn the different genres and the different language features needed. It might be an investigation report, quite a complex genre. Or it might be a problem solution type of genre. So there are a number of different genres depending on the tasks that they're doing. So we need to be very careful about identifying the purpose for each task, and therefore the genre and the language that they're going to need in order to complete the task. So a genre approach, if we look at the principles involved, we talk about engaging students with substantial content, rich tasks and authentic texts from all areas of the curriculum and from the students' community and social lives. A genre approach identifies the language demands of the task and explicitly teaches the language that they're going to need in order to complete the task successfully. We provide high levels of scaffolding that's differentiated according to students' needs, and that scaffolding is to enable the students to achieve goals that they couldn't achieve if left by themselves. And this type of approach purposefully integrates all the language modes: oral interaction, listening, reading, writing, and using visual information, so that we don't fragment them into different areas of teaching. To do that, we need a framework that enables us to do all of that work and integrate all of the modes, and we use a teaching and learning cycle as such a framework. The teaching and learning cycle looks like this, and it builds up the students' knowledge about the topic and their literacy skills as we work through the teaching and learning cycle, and they become more independent in their use of the language. So we start off with a very brief introduction to the topic or the field knowledge that they're going to be developing. And we do this by lots of discussion of the topic, finding out what they already know about it, using lots of hands-on materials and activities, lots of visuals. So, for example, interpreting diagrams, watching videos, etc. Activities that involve hands-on use of materials, and things like excursions. So not yet getting heavily into reading in order to develop their field knowledge, but just this introduction through lots of different modes. Pauline Gibbons refers to this as message abundancy, so that students are encountering similar messages, understandings about the content, but through a great variety of modes. The knowledge of the field continues to be built up throughout the teaching and learning cycle, and so you don't have to do that all at once, but it's then continued and deepened through supported reading. So they're now continuing to develop their knowledge of the field, but through reading, and reading that is supported by the teacher. So teaching them how to read the kinds of texts that perhaps they haven't had to read before, because these are more academic texts that they might not have encountered in their daily lives. So at this point we would be doing lots of very familiar activities that teachers use all the time. Activities such as modelled reading, shared reading, guided reading, and collaborative reading. We think about the gradual release of responsibility, where we move from a heavy focus on the teacher, with the teacher modelling how I would go about as a proficient reader, reading this text, the strategies that I would use, the decisions that I would make, how I would go about skimming the text, for example, to find out how the text is organised. So modelling for the students the processes involved and the strategies involved in reading a text like that. Moving on to shared reading, where the students are engaged with the reading, that they participate with the teacher guides them through the text, and they all participate in the reading of the text. Guided reading is where the teacher organises the class into groups that all have similar needs, so that she is able to focus on the particular needs of the students and do some differentiated teaching. Collaborative reading is where we move into group reading, small group, paired reading, that kind of thing, where the students are doing collaborative work, collaborative activities around the topic. And onto independent reading, where the students now are using a lot of the strategies that have been introduced and are doing reading activities independently and perhaps choosing their own texts, that kind of thing. Once the students have developed a fair bit of knowledge about the topic, both through the initial introduction to the topic and also through their reading that's been heavily supported by the teacher in teaching them how to read the kinds of texts that they're encountering in academic contexts. So they've built up their understanding of the topic to a certain extent. They've probably taken notes, and now they have to think about, well, how am I going to organise all of these understandings that I've developed about the topic? And that's where they need to now understand how the genre is organised. And so we, at this point, focus now on the genre itself, how it's organised, the stages that it goes through, and some of its typical language features. We'd start off by looking at the purpose of the text, because that will give us a clue as to the genre being used. And once we've discussed the purpose of the text, we might identify how it's organised, the little phases that come within the big stages of a text, and some of the key language features. In this one, for example, it's a unit, a task that looks at explaining acne. And we might look, for example, if we were modelling for the students how this text is organised, we would identify things like, well, how does it start? And in this case, it starts by classifying the different types of acne. It then goes on to explain how acne is formed. So at this stage of the text, we get a sequential explanation, explaining the sequence of how acne is formed. It then goes on to look at the various causes of acne. So now we're looking at an explanation, but this time not a sequence, but looking at the various causes, so a causal explanation. It then goes into the language, some of the language features of a text like this, and because it's an explanation, they're going to need the language of explaining. So we get into things like the causes, because, as, since, due to, etc., and the effects, as a result, consequently, therefore. So there's a whole range of things that we could talk about in terms of the kind of language resources that they need if they're going to be writing an explanation text. So looking at the relevant language features for that particular type of text. In this case, they also looked at the difference between a personal recount of getting text as it's, in this case, and a more academic explanation. So the different choices that we make according to the register, whether it's a very personal one or a more academic one. Once we've learnt about the genre, how it's organised, and we've modelled that for the students, we've given them examples, we've helped them to identify the language features that are typical of that genre, then we move on to supporting them in writing a similar text. So this is where we get into various ways of supporting their writing. And as with reading, we might look at how we model writing for them in terms of myself as a model, how I would go about writing a text like this. So I might demonstrate to them how I would go about writing a text, maybe an explanation, the kinds of choices that I would make, the decisions about how to organise it, the kinds of language features that I might include. We would then move on to encouraging the students to actually participate in jointly constructing a text. And so the teacher would then guide them in constructing a text together as a class or as small groups. Once they've experienced what's involved in writing a text like this, they might then do some collaborative writing in pairs or small groups, and there's also the opportunity for the teacher, again, to work with small groups with similar needs. So again, we have our gradual release of responsibility with writing, very similar to reading. So very much focused initially on the teacher, I do. Involving the students in writing a text, we do together, but I'm leading. Guided writing, you do it, but I'm going to observe what you're doing and I'm going to support you. Into collaborative writing, where the students are becoming less dependent on the teacher and they're engaged themselves in writing texts collaboratively. And onto your independent, the I do part of that gradual release of responsibility model. Finally, we're into independent use of the genre, where the students have had a fair bit of support all the way through the teaching and learning cycle in building up their understanding of the topic, being able to read about the topic, the kinds of texts that they need to be able to read in academic contexts, in learning about the genre that they're going to be writing, and encouraging them to participate in the collaborative writing of texts, and then they should be able at this point to independently go about writing a similar text. So at this stage, they might be involved in reviewing the drafts that they've been writing, in conferencing with their peers, in drafting, revising, editing, proofreading, and the teacher can be giving, again, differentiated support as needed as they write their own texts independently. You'll notice that it's not a lockstep sequence of stages in the cycle. You're coming in and out of those different stages all the time, so it's not as if it's a straitjacket, but it's a general movement from dependence on the teacher towards independence, but with a lot of very tight scaffolding in between. What we haven't mentioned, and what's very important, is the role of oral interaction in the cycle. And oral interaction is going to be facilitating the understandings all the way through. So we need to take account of talking to learn, so those kinds of discussions that we have where we're thinking together. At the heart of the teaching and learning cycle is formative assessment, so assessing students' progress as they move through the cycle so that you can give feedback to them at appropriate points and you can be responsive to what you're observing in their learning so that you can then change what you're doing in response to the needs that you've observed. What we ask the students to do quite often is to, at the very beginning of the cycle, to just write whatever they can on the topic in that genre. And then that acts as baseline data for what they're going to, how they're going to be able to improve that very first draft by all of the input and feedback that they're going to be getting throughout the cycle. So we might then ask them, once they've done a fair bit of supported reading, where they've developed their understanding of the topic, to now incorporate that into their evolving draft. And quite often we ask them to highlight the bits that they have incorporated into their draft and to discuss with the teacher what they've included and why and how it's made it better, how it's made the draft better. When they've learnt about the genre, they should now have a better idea of how to organise all of that information that they've been collecting. So again, they should be able to demonstrate to the teacher how they have taken on board what she has been modelling about how the genre is organised and how they've incorporated into their draft some of the language features that they've been focusing on that are relevant to the topic, relevant to the genre. When they've been engaged in supported writing, then they might have much more insight into what's involved in writing a text like this, and again they can go back and redraft the text that they've been working on. And then finally, at each point they've been saving these drafts, and so at the final stage in independent writing, they'll do their final polishing up and revision and saving. So they'll have a number of drafts saved as they go through the cycle, and they can then look back and say, gosh, look at my first draft and how I've improved at each stage because I've been able to incorporate into my drafts all of the material that you've been introducing them to along the way. So just to sum up, the teaching and learning cycle is all about gradual release of responsibility from the teacher so that the students can take over that role themselves, can take over the responsibility. And we do that through differentiated scaffolding. So scaffolding that takes account of the needs of the various students, responding to their needs as they're observed in their drafting along the way. And ultimately leading towards increased responsibility, which is of course our aim, that the students are able to write texts like the ones that they need to do in their academic contexts so that they feel confident and they can feel as if they're capable of achieving the outcomes of that task, including the language and literacy outcomes.